It was a bright Saturday morning in a quiet neighborhood where all the lawns were neatly cut. Every house looked the same, and even the mailboxes stood in perfect rows like little soldiers. Everything had rules there, rules about what color you could paint your fence, how tall your grass could grow, and even what kind of plants you could have in your front yard. But one house stood out, not because it was messy, but because of a small old-fashioned mailbox sitting proudly by the driveway. The mailbox wasn't shiny or modern. It was an antique piece from the early 1900s painted in faded red with a brass handle and a little sign that said, "Letters only." It looked like something from another time, something with a story. And it did have a story. It belonged to a man named James Whitaker. James had worked as a postal worker for over 30 years. Delivering mail had been his life, his daily rhythm, his way of meeting people. Rain or shine, he knew every name on his route, every family's dog, and even which houses liked to get their mail at the door instead of the box. When he retired, he wanted to keep a piece of that life with him. So when he saw the old mailbox at a collector's market, he bought it immediately. To him, it wasn't just a box, it was a memory of decades spent serving others. He cleaned it up, painted it carefully, and set it in front of his house. Every morning, he'd walk down his driveway, coffee in hand, check for letters, and smile. It gave him a small sense of joy, like the world still had some old-fashioned charm left in it. But one day, that charm came under fire. When James opened his mail one morning, he noticed a white envelope with a stamp reading HOA notice. He sighed. Anyone who lived in that neighborhood knew what that meant. Inside, there was a neatly printed letter with a bold heading, "Violation of Mailbox Design Standards." The letter said his mailbox didn't meet community appearance guidelines and needed to be replaced with an approved model within 14 days. James read it twice, thinking maybe it was a mistake. He looked out at his mailbox, standing proudly as always. What could possibly be wrong with it? It wasn't broken. It wasn't ugly. It wasn't even in the way. But the HOA rules said all mailboxes had to be a specific size, color, and shape. The exact same as everyone else's. His antique box, with its character and history, didn't fit the mold. He chuckled at first, thinking maybe he could just call them and explain. After all, it was a special mailbox, not some random decoration. He dialed the HOA office and politely explained his situation. He told them he was a retired postal worker, that the box had sentimental value and that it wasn't harming anyone. But the voice on the other end was cold and scripted. "I'm sorry, sir," the woman said. "Rules are rules. All mailboxes must conform to community design standards. If you fail to replace it, you will be subject to daily fines." James tried to reason with her. He even offered to paint it the approved color, but she simply repeated the same thing. Rules are rules. Finally, he hung up, frustrated but not defeated. That night, he sat on his porch watching the sunset over the rows of matching houses. It all looked so neat, so perfect, so lifeless. Every mailbox on the street looked identical. Small black metal boxes with the same dull number stickers. No character, no charm, no story. And then there was his, the only one that seemed to have a heartbeat. The next day, he got a few visits from curious neighbors. One woman from down the street said she thought his mailbox was lovely and couldn't understand why the HOA cared so much. Another man warned him that the board was strict and they'd fine him no matter what. But James just smiled and said, "Some things are worth standing up for even if it's just a mailbox." Days passed and more letters came. The HOA wasn't backing down. They started sending warnings, official-looking ones with bold red ink. Non-compliance notice. Immediate action required. Daily fines will be imposed. It was ridiculous, James thought. He had lived a quiet, respectful life, paid his dues, and now he was being treated like a troublemaker over a piece of metal. He called the board one more time, this time speaking directly to the HOA president, a man who took his job a little too seriously. The conversation didn't go well. The president told James that his mailbox was a visual distraction and that community harmony relies on consistency. James laughed under his breath. "Harmony," he said. "You're worried about harmony over a mailbox?" The man didn't appreciate the humor. That night, James sat in his living room looking at the notice again. He could just replace the mailbox, sure. It would be easy. but something about the whole situation didn't sit right. He wasn't trying to rebel. He wasn't trying to be difficult. He just wanted to keep something that mattered to him. It reminded him of his years of hard work, of his identity, and suddenly it felt like they were trying to erase that. He walked outside and ran his hand along the old metal box. The paint was chipped in places, but it still looked strong. He thought of the thousands of letters he'd delivered over the years. Love letters, birthday cards, news from soldiers, college acceptance envelopes, even bad news sometimes. Every mailbox he'd ever opened meant something to someone. And now this one meant something to him. The neighborhood was quiet that evening. The sprinklers clicked on in a row and porch lights flickered to life. James stood there for a long time, looking at the rows of identical mailboxes stretching down the street. He realized that people had gotten used to sameness. They'd forgotten that a little difference wasn't chaos. It was what made life interesting. When he went back inside, he made himself a cup of tea and opened his laptop. If the HOA wanted to make this about rules, he was going to learn the rules, all of them. He started searching for local ordinances, postal regulations, and community laws. The more he read, the more he realized something interesting. Mailboxes, especially those used for official postal service delivery, were under federal protection. Not even the HOA had full authority over them. The thought made him smile. Maybe there was a way out of this after all. Maybe he could find a loophole. Or maybe he'd just have to get creative. Either way, he wasn't ready to give up yet. He looked out the window one more time before bed. His little red mailbox glowed softly under the porch light, stubbornly standing there against the sea of black boxes. For the first time in a while, James felt excited. Not angry, not tired, but quietly determined. He had no idea that this small fight over a mailbox was about to turn into something much bigger. But for now, he was ready to stand his ground. After all, it wasn't just a mailbox to him. It was a piece of his story, and he wasn't about to let anyone write it for him. James woke up early the next morning with the sun peeking through the curtains. The coffee pot gurgled softly in the kitchen as he sat down at the table with his laptop still open from the night before. The HOA letter lay beside it, wrinkled from how many times he had read it. He sighed, took a sip of coffee, and opened another tab to keep reading about local property laws. He wasn't sure what he was looking for exactly, but he knew there had to be something, a detail or exception that the HOA had overlooked. He wasn't a lawyer, but 30 years working in the Postal Service had taught him to pay attention to the fine print. The small lines, the details others ignored. Hours passed. He read articles, forums, even a few legal documents he barely understood. But buried deep in a postal regulation page, he found something interesting. A note that said all mailboxes used for United States Postal Service delivery fell under federal authority. In other words, once a box was used to receive official mail, no local organization could alter or remove it without permission. That tiny paragraph made him grin. Maybe, just maybe, he had a chance. He printed it out and highlighted the line. The next day he walked over to the HOA office. The building was small but fancy, glass doors, neat landscaping, and that same air of control that he'd come to expect. He greeted the receptionist kindly and asked to speak with the HOA president. After a few minutes, a tall man in a neatly pressed shirt came out, holding a clipboard like it was a shield. "Ah, Mr. Whitaker," he said in a polite but stiff voice. "I was just about to send you another notice." James smiled slightly and handed him the paper. "Before you do that," he said, "I think you should read this." The man looked confused but took the page. His eyes moved down the text quickly. When he was done, he gave a short laugh. "Sir, you can't possibly think a single paragraph from a website gives you the right to ignore HOA policy." James didn't flinch. "I'm not ignoring policy," he said. "I'm following federal law. The post office owns authority over that mailbox, not you. You might want to check with them before you find me again." The man frowned, clearly annoyed. "We'll review this," he said curtly. "But our rules still stand. If you don't replace it by Friday, you'll face daily penalties." James nodded, thanked him calmly, and left. He could tell the man didn't take him seriously, right, but that was fine. He wasn't finished yet. Over the next few days, the mailbox issue became the talk of the neighborhood. Some people quietly admired James for standing up to the HOA. Others thought he was making too much fuss. One evening, while James was watering his lawn, a couple walking their dog stopped by. "We heard about your mailbox," the woman said, smiling. Good for you. Someone needed to tell them to calm down. Her husband laughed. You're brave, man. They fined me last year because my garbage bins were visible from the street. James chuckled. It's not bravery, he said. It's just about keeping a little freedom. Still, not everyone saw it that way. A few neighbors started avoiding eye contact, afraid the HOA might think they supported him. One board member even walked by and took pictures of his house, writing notes on a clipboard. It didn't bother James much, though. He had faced tougher people in his years delivering mail in bad weather and rough neighborhoods. A few rule enforcers in polo shirts didn't scare him, but deep down he knew this wasn't just about one mailbox anymore. It was about principle. It was about the small ways people get pushed around and told what to do, even when it doesn't make sense. The more he thought about it, the more determined he became. Later that week, he decided to call an old friend from his postal days, someone who still worked with the USPS. They hadn't spoken in a while, but when James explained the situation, his friend laughed in disbelief. They're really giving you grief over a mailbox? His friend said. That's ridiculous. You have no idea, James replied. I just want to know if there's any legal way to make them leave me alone. Well, his friend said thoughtfully, if your property were designated as a postal facility, even a microbranch or substation, it would technically be under federal jurisdiction. The HOA couldn't touch it. James raised an eyebrow. A postal facility? Like a post office? Exactly, his friend said. You'd have to go through some paperwork, but it's possible. I can help you with the forms if you really want to go that far. James leaned back in his chair, silent for a moment. The idea sounded crazy, turning his property into a kind of small post office. But the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. It wasn't just a loophole. It was poetic. A retired mailman using the postal system itself to protect his mailbox. I might just take you up on that, he finally said, a grin spreading across his face. That night, James couldn't sleep. His mind kept racing with ideas. He even found himself sketching out a small wooden sign in a notebook that read, Whitaker Postal Annex. It made him laugh. But it also made him feel alive again, like he had a purpose. The next few days were busy. James filled out forms, researched zoning rules, and gathered paperwork. He even took a short drive to the nearest small-town post office to ask a few questions in person. The clerk there looked at him curiously but was kind and helpful. She confirmed what his friend said. It wasn't easy, but it was possible. Meanwhile, the HOA sent another warning letter. Final notice before enforcement. James pinned it to his fridge like a trophy. He wasn't backing down now. His small act of defiance began to inspire people around him. A few neighbors stopped to chat more often. One elderly lady brought him cookies and whispered, I'm cheering for you. Even the mail carrier, who had been quietly watching the drama unfold, gave him a thumbs up one morning and said, You're the talk of the route. By the end of the week, James mailed off his application to officially register his property as a postal substation. It was a long shot, but it was worth it. As he sealed the envelope and placed it carefully in his antique mailbox, he smiled to himself. He didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was certain. He wasn't just defending a mailbox anymore. He was standing up for something bigger. The right to keep a piece of his life, his story, his individuality, in a world that wanted everything to look the same. The HOA had no idea what was coming next. For now, James just went back inside, poured himself another cup of coffee, and looked out the window at his old red mailbox. It stood there like a quiet little rebel, a reminder that sometimes the smallest things can make the biggest stand. The morning James received the envelope from the Postal Service, he could already tell it was important. It was heavier than normal mail and had that official seal printed in the corner. He carried it to the kitchen table, set down his coffee, and opened it carefully with a butter knife. Inside was a letter that made him grin from ear to ear. His request had been reviewed and approved. His property was now officially recognized as a temporary postal substation, Whitaker Postal Annex, exactly as he had written on the forms. He sat there for a long moment, just staring at the paper. It was real. The old mailman in him couldn't help but laugh. Who would have thought? After all those years of sorting, stamping, and delivering mail, he now technically owned a little branch of the post office, even if it was only on paper. He looked out the window at his red mailbox. It gleamed in the sunlight like it knew it had just won a battle. Later that day, he drove into town to the small building that had sparked this idea in the first place. It was an old, decommissioned post office on the edge of town, a brick building with peeling paint and a for sale sign out front. Most people had ignored it, but to James it was perfect. He walked around the property, running his hand over the faded blue door. He could already see what it could become. It wasn't big, just a single room, an old counter, and a back area filled with dust. But it had history. You could almost feel the echo of letters being sorted and stamps being pressed. The realtor met him there, surprised by his enthusiasm. "You sure you want to buy this?" she asked. "Most people don't see the point. It's been empty for years," James smiled. "It's not just a building to me," he said. "It's a story." He signed the papers that afternoon. It took most of his savings, but he didn't regret it for a second. When he got the keys, he stood in the doorway for a while, breathing in the smell of dust and old paper. It felt like coming home. Over the next few weeks, he worked on fixing it up. He swept, painted, repaired the counter, and cleaned every corner until the place looked alive again. A few of his old postal friends stopped by to help. They laughed, shared stories, and even brought him a few leftover mail bags as souvenirs. Word started spreading around town. The retired mailman had bought the post office. People thought it was funny at first, but when they heard about the HOA trouble, they understood the deeper reason. It wasn't just a joke. It was a statement. Meanwhile, the HOA had no idea what was happening. They continued sending letters, still demanding that he replace his mailbox. But this time, James had something powerful to show them. One bright Monday morning, he walked into the HOA office with a folder under his arm. The same board members were there, when sitting in their usual circle, looking stern. The president frowned the moment James walked in. "Mr. Whitaker," he said, "if this is about your mailbox again, I assure you our decision hasn't changed." James smiled calmly and handed him the papers. "Actually," he said, "I think it just did." The man took the documents, glanced over them, then looked up confused. "What is this?" "That," James said, "is an official letter from the United States Postal Service. As of last week, my property is registered as a recognized postal substation. My mailbox now falls under federal protection. Your rules don't apply." The room went silent. A few board members exchanged awkward glances. The president blinked several times, clearly unsure what to say. "Are you serious?" he asked finally. "Completely," James said. "You can call the regional office if you'd like to confirm." The man stared at the papers again, his lips pressed into a thin line. "We'll need to review this with our legal team," he muttered. "Take your time," James replied, turning toward the door. "In the meantime, I'll keep my mailbox right where it is." When he walked out of the building, he couldn't help but laugh. It wasn't a loud laugh, just that quiet kind of satisfaction you feel when you know you've won fair and square. A few days later, a local news crew showed up at his house. Someone from the neighborhood had told them the story, and they thought it was too good to ignore. The reporter was young and cheerful, holding a microphone with a big smile. "So," she said, "you actually bought the old post office because your HOA complained about your mailbox?" James chuckled. "I guess you could say that. They didn't like my mailbox, so I made sure it had a permanent home." The story aired that evening under the headline, "Retired Mailman Outsmarts HOA, Buys the Post Office." Within days, people all over town were talking about it. Some even drove by just to see the famous red mailbox. For James, it wasn't about fame. It was about peace, the peace of knowing he'd stood his ground with dignity. He hadn't yelled or broken any laws. He'd simply played by the rules, better than the people who wrote them. The following week, the HOA sent one final letter. This one was shorter than the rest. It said, "After reviewing recent developments, we will no longer pursue any action regarding your mailbox. Thank you for your cooperation." James pinned that letter next to the first one, the violation notice, right on his refrigerator door. It made him smile every time he saw them side by side. Soon after, he hung a small wooden sign next to the mailbox that read, "Whitaker Postal Annex, established 2025. It wasn't fancy, but it had meaning. Neighbors started stopping by to take photos with it, and even the mail carrier gave a little salute whenever she passed. One afternoon, a man from down the street who had always been quiet stopped by with his daughter. He said he admired what James had done. Most people would have just given up, he said. You made it about something bigger, James nodded. Sometimes it's not about winning, he said softly. It's about not letting small things. That night, as the sun set and the neighborhood lights flickered on, James sat on his porch with a cup of tea. He watched his red mailbox glow under the porch light, a small but powerful reminder of what happens when you stand up for something you love. He thought about all the years he had spent delivering mail, and how much life had changed since then. But one thing never changed: the meaning of a mailbox. It was still a symbol of connection, of stories, of people reaching out to each other, and now, his little red mailbox had its own story, one that would be told for years to come. For a few quiet days, life went back to normal. James would wake up early, pour his coffee, and walk out to his driveway to check the mail just like always. But something was different now. Neighbors waved more often. Cars slowed down when they passed his house. People smiled when they saw the red mailbox standing proudly in front of his home with the little wooden sign beside it. Whitaker Postal Annex. Established 2025. It had become a small symbol of independence, a reminder that one person could still stand up to something bigger than them and win with grace. But the peace didn't last long. The story that aired on local television had spread faster than anyone expected. It was shared online again and again. Soon, news outlets from other states picked it up. Headlines started appearing everywhere. Retired mailman outsmarts HOA with brilliant move. The man who bought the post office to save his mailbox. And even one that called him the hero of homeowners everywhere. James didn't think much of it at first. He wasn't looking for attention. He just wanted to live peacefully in his home without being told what kind of mailbox he could have. But when he checked his email one morning, he had over 100 unread messages. Some were from journalists, others from people across the country who had seen his story and wanted to thank him. There were messages from homeowners who had their own battles with HOAs. People who said his story gave them courage to speak up. One email simply said, "Thank you for reminding us that rules should serve people and not control them." It was strange, but heartwarming. A few days later, a major news network called, asking if they could do an interview at his home. James hesitated. He wasn't used to cameras or microphones. But after thinking it over, he agreed. If his story could help others, maybe it was worth it. When the film crew arrived, they were friendly and respectful. They filmed his house, the red mailbox, and even took a few shots of him sorting mail in his newly restored post office building. The reporter asked him what message he wanted to share with others. James smiled and said, "It's not about breaking rules. It's about common sense. Sometimes people forget that behind every house, every mailbox, there's a person. And people deserve respect, not just rules." The interview aired that night, and suddenly his quiet street wasn't so quiet anymore. Cars drove by slowly, some honking and waving. A few even stopped to take pictures. The local coffee shop named a drink after him, the Mailman's Brew. Most of the town found it funny and inspiring, but the HOA board did not. When they realized how much attention the story was getting, they called an emergency meeting. They were worried about how it made them look, like bullies who had picked a fight over a mailbox and lost. Some of the board members wanted to issue a public statement, while others argued they should stay silent and hope the story would fade away. Eventually, the HOA president released a short note online. It said they deeply valued community harmony and that the situation had been misunderstood. But the damage was done. People laughed at the statement. Because everyone knew the truth, neighbors, who had once been afraid to speak up, now started talking about their own frustrations with the HOA. Someone mentioned the time they were fined for having the wrong color flower pots. Another person shared how they got a warning because their garden gnome was not in alignment with community aesthetics. James didn't join in the criticism. He wasn't trying to humiliate anyone. He just wanted to show that there were limits to how far rules should go. He tried to stay humble even as people praised him. One evening, he received a letter, but this time it wasn't from the HOA. It was from a regional postal officer, congratulating him for what they called an excellent act of postal preservation. The letter thanked him for honoring the history of postal work and keeping its spirit alive. They even offered to send him a small plaque to display at his home post office. When the plaque arrived a week later, James mounted it proudly inside his little building. It read, recognized by the United States Postal Service for community contribution and dedication to postal heritage. He took a step back and looked at it with a quiet smile. That old building, which had been forgotten by everyone else, now had life again, but not everyone was happy about his fame. The HOA president stopped by one day, standing awkwardly by the edge of James's driveway. He wasn't angry, more embarrassed than anything. "Mr. Whitaker," he said, clearing his throat. "I just wanted to talk." James nodded and offered him a seat on the porch. The man looked around, clearly uncomfortable as neighbors walked by, nodding politely. "I suppose this whole thing got bigger than it should have," the man said finally. "The board's been getting calls. People think we're the villains." James smiled kindly. "I don't see you as villains," he said. "But sometimes rules can make good people forget about reason." The man nodded slowly. "Maybe we were too strict," he admitted. "We'll be reviewing some of our policies. Things have gotten a little too rigid." "That's a good start," James said, sipping his tea. "People just want to feel heard." Before the man left, he shook James's hand. It wasn't an apology exactly, but it was close enough. After that, things began to change around the neighborhood. The HOA started relaxing some of its minor rules. People painted their fences slightly different shades, added little decorations to their mailboxes, and even started chatting more. The place suddenly felt more alive, less like a row of matching houses and more like a real community. Every time someone walked past, they'd wave or stop to ask about the story. Kids loved visiting his mailbox and hearing how it all happened. Sometimes he'd tell them, "It's just a mailbox, but it taught a big lesson." By the end of the month, his story had gone viral across social media. Videos about him had millions of views, and he was getting letters from all over the country, actual handwritten letters. People sent postcards from small towns, thanking him for standing up for something simple but meaningful. His kitchen table was covered in envelopes, each one carrying a story. He kept them all, stacking them neatly in boxes inside his little post office building. He called it his wall of kindness. Every now and then he'd go there, sit down, and read a few. Some letters made him laugh. Some brought tears to his eyes. It amazed him how one small act, just refusing to replace an old mailbox, had touched so many hearts. That night, as the neighborhood lights twinkled, James stood by his porch again. The air was cool, the sky clear, and the soft sound of crickets filled the background. He looked at his red mailbox, standing tall like it always had. He smiled to himself and whispered, "You and I did all right." And as he walked back inside, he couldn't help but feel that this wasn't just the end of a fight. It was the start of something better. Months had passed since the mailbox battle ended, and life in the neighborhood had changed in small but beautiful ways. It wasn't that the place suddenly turned wild or chaotic. The lawns were still trimmed, the streets still clean, and the houses still neat. But there was something new in the air, a kind of freedom that hadn't been there before. The houses didn't all look exactly the same anymore. A few people added flowers around their mailboxes. Someone painted theirs blue with a tiny bird design. Another neighbor built a wooden one shaped like a little cottage. Nobody complained. Nobody sent warning letters. The HOA, now quieter and humbler, seemed to finally understand that a neighborhood was meant to be lived in, not controlled like a showroom. And at the center of it all stood James's red mailbox, unchanged and proud as ever. It had become more than just a mailbox now. It was a story. It was a symbol. People still stopped by to see it, sometimes leaving small notes or postcards inside just to say hello. The mailbox had turned into something special, a reminder that even small acts of courage can echo far beyond what anyone expects. James had gotten used to the attention by now. He still received letters from people across the country. Homeowners, retirees, even a few teenagers who said they learned about his story in school. One letter came from a young man who wrote, "You reminded me that standing up for something doesn't have to mean yelling. It can mean standing quietly but firmly." Those words stuck with James for a long time. Every morning he followed the same routine: coffee, newspaper, and a short walk to the mailbox. It might sound ordinary, but to him it was sacred. It reminded him of the days when he carried letters through rain and snow, when every door he approached meant a small connection between people. He had always believed that delivering mail was about more than paper and stamps. It was about trust. One day, as he was sweeping his porch, he noticed a small group of people standing in front of his old post office building down the road. He walked over, curious. A woman from the city's heritage department was there, holding a clipboard. "Mr. Whitaker?" she asked with a smile. "We've been reviewing historic sites in the area. We heard your story and wanted to talk to you about something." James nodded politely. "What's that?" She handed him a paper. "We'd like to designate your building as a local historic landmark, Whitaker Postal Annex. It's inspired a lot of people, and we think it deserves to be preserved." James looked at her, a bit stunned. He had never imagined something like that. He wasn't a man who chased recognition, but as he looked at the old building, freshly painted with the small plaque on the wall, he felt proud. Not just for himself, but for what it represented. He agreed, of course. And a few weeks later, the town held a small ceremony. Nothing fancy, just neighbors, friends, and a few local officials standing under the afternoon sun. They unveiled a bronze sign that read, "Whitaker Postal Annex, established 2025. A symbol of individuality, community, and the power of one person's quiet courage." There was a round of applause. A few people even wiped away tears. James stood quietly, his hands folded in front of him, humbled by it all. After the ceremony, people gathered around with cups of lemonade and cookies. Some shared their own stories of dealing with rules and red tape. Others just came to thank him for reminding them that small acts can matter. Later that evening, as the crowd faded and the street grew quiet, James stayed behind for a while. The sun was setting, casting a soft orange glow over the old brick building. He walked around the small post office, running his fingers over the rough surface of the wall. He thought about all the years he had spent delivering mail, the long days, the heavy bags, the friendly faces along his route. It had been honest work that connected people, one letter at a time. And now somehow, even in retirement, he had found a way to keep that spirit alive. He walked back home, feeling peaceful. The evening air was cool, and a gentle breeze rustled through the trees. When he reached his porch, he sat down in his favorite chair and watched the street. Children were playing catch down the road. A couple was walking their dog. The smell of barbecue drifted through the air. Life, in all its simple beauty, carried on. Then he noticed something new. Across the street, one of his younger neighbors was putting up a mailbox that looked handmade, painted bright yellow with flowers on the side. The neighbor waved to him and called out, "Hope you don't mind. Your story inspired me." James laughed softly and waved back. "Looks great," he said. It warmed his heart to see it. Not because everyone was copying him, but because people finally felt comfortable expressing themselves. The neighborhood felt more human now, less about perfection, more about belonging. Later that night, he sat by the window with a small stack of letters he hadn't opened yet. They were from people he didn't know, strangers who had seen his story online. One was from a retired teacher, another from a family who had once been fined for having too many plants in their yard. Each letter shared gratitude and admiration. As he read them, James felt something deeper than pride, and he felt connection. It was the same feeling he used to get when he handed someone their long-awaited letter or delivered a package that made their day. It was the feeling of being part of something larger than himself. Before heading to bed, he stepped outside one last time. The street was quiet, lit only by the soft glow of porch lights. His red mailbox stood there steady and strong, as if guarding the memories of everything that had happened. He placed his hand on it gently and whispered, "You've done well, old friend." And maybe it was just the cool night air, or maybe it was the warmth of his own thoughts, but he could have sworn that in that moment, the little red mailbox seemed to shine a bit brighter. As the days went on, the story of the man who bought the post office to save his mailbox became more than just a funny headline. It became a tale people told about standing up for what mattered, with patience, with grace, and with heart. The HOA never bothered him again. In fact, they eventually invited him to speak at one of their meetings about balancing community and individuality. He agreed, smiling quietly at how things had come full circle. When he spoke, he said something simple but true. Rules keep things in order, but kindness keeps them alive. A neighborhood isn't meant to look perfect. It's meant to feel like home. That line stayed with people long after, and so, the man who once faced fines over a mailbox ended up teaching everyone, not just his neighbors, but thousands of strangers and what home really means. It's not about matching fences or spotless lawns. It's about people, stories, and the freedom to be yourself. And that's how the red mailbox that once caused so much trouble became a lasting piece of history. A quiet reminder that even the smallest stand can leave the biggest mark.